Hello, students. And now for the topic you have been waiting for all year. I know. Every single day of the past year, you have been hearing about this particular thing, as we will call it right now. And so let's not delay. Let's get into it right away as we begin today talking about viruses. Oh, yes, the coronavirus has made the news in 2020 like nothing before. Not since the plague, perhaps, has a little thing like a virus. In fact, the plague was caused by a bacteria, not a virus. But let's just get right to it, shall we? You've heard all the news about it. Let's discuss now what exactly are viruses, because there are some misconceptions out there. So let's begin with what is a virus? A virus, by definition, is a tiny particle that invades living cells. Now, this is, as we're going to see here in the next couple slides, this is a really important point to make here. They are tiny particles. We're not calling them organisms for good reason. We'll get to that in a moment. But viruses, you've heard of computer viruses, and no, computer viruses don't cause computers to get sick like this, although viruses like this can cause you to get sick like this. But we know that a computer virus, if it's in your particular computer, if your computer's not protected against a computer virus, that virus can take over your computer and basically make your computer worthless. Similar thing can happen with the other type of virus if you become infected with it. So let's get back to what I meant about this tiny particle thing. Here's the deal. Viruses are not living things. Think about that for a moment. Viruses aren't even alive, and they have impacted our lives to an incredible degree over the years, and in particular this past year. But they're not even living things because they do not perform functions of living cells. Viruses can't do anything by themselves. They need a host in order to reproduce. Viruses are not living things. They don't perform any of those functions. Remember, in the first unit, we talked about all of those forms of metabolism, ingestion, digestion, excretion, respiration. Viruses don't do any of that because they are not living things. They are just these tiny particles that can wreak havoc with living things. They're really quite a nuisance to us in many respects, from the common cold, which can make a day miserable, to the COVID-19 virus that can make lives and entire cultures completely miserable. They need a host in order to reproduce. So if we do not provide that host, guess what? A virus can't do anything. They must have a host in order to, now I put reproduce in quotation marks here because they are really not reproducing. They are forcing you in your cells to do their dirty work for them because, again, they don't perform any function of living things, including reproducing. They don't reproduce. They have you reproduce for them. The bottom line is this: if they don't have a host, they can't do anything on their own. So take their host away, and so will they. Think about that for a moment as we continue to struggle this year fighting the coronavirus. So let's get to a couple characteristics of viruses, shall we? Beginning with their size. Now, get a load of this. You thought cells were small, and we need microscopes in order to see the structure of cells. There isn't a light microscope on Earth powerful enough to see viruses, because viruses are measured in nanometers. What is a nanometer? It's a billionth of a meter. They are so much smaller than cells, you can't see viruses. We can't see them with their eye. We can't even see them with a microscope. We need specialized equipment called electron microscopes, which don't use light to view structures, but use electrons from atoms, which are much smaller than photons of light, in order to view viruses. And even then, they are incredibly small to detect. Billionths of a meter, nanometers, is the size that we're talking about here. Think about that for a minute. Your fingernail is 1 millimeter. A millimeter is 1,000th of a meter. Take your fingernail, the thickness of your fingernail, and divide it 1 million times. That's a nanometer. I can't even conceive of just how small that is. So viruses are really, really small. They are, if this were a cell, viruses are even much smaller than this to scale. You wouldn't even be able to see the speck on this slide in comparison to the size of a cell. And yet, even though they are that small, we have and continue to learn a great deal about viruses. And we're making great headway as of this pandemic going on in 2020, as far as manipulating the DNA, the hereditary material found in viruses, to do some pretty funky things. By the time you see this video, there will already have been dozens of new discoveries made. And all you have to do is just Google virus research and find a whole host of things that we couldn't even conceive of a year ago. So we do know a little bit about the structure of viruses. This is a typical virus. It's called a bacteriophage. And this is a virus that affects bacteria. We know a lot about them because they are relatively larger than other viruses. And so we've studied them quite a bit. But our understanding of viruses right now is that they have an outer coat of protein. And protein is an organic molecule that is produced. But this outer coat of protein provides protection from other things like the environment. So imagine it was raining outside. You could wear a raincoat or carry an umbrella, and that would protect you from the rain. Imagine it was cold outside. You could wear a winter jacket, and that would protect you from the cold temperature and the snow outside. Well, viruses have a coat as well, and this outer coat of protein provides protection. And this outer coat of protein can be very durable, and it can be very difficult to penetrate this protein coat in order to get to the inside of a virus, which houses an inner core of hereditary material. And again, this inner core of Hereditary material is not contained in a life-functioning cell as we are used to. And they don't just, this hereditary material isn't floating around in the cytoplasm at all, because there is no cytoplasm in a virus as there is in a bacteria. Bacteria are living things. They reproduce, they carry on functions, as you've seen in some of those videos earlier this week. But viruses don't do any of that. But this hereditary material is what controls the reproduction of a virus, or the duplication of viruses, the mass production might be even more accurate of viruses, that they take advantage of their host by injecting this hereditary material and take over the cells of a host. Now, most of you have been invaded by viruses in the past. If you've ever had the common cold, the cold is produced by a type of coronavirus, not the one that you hear about in the news all the time. It's not COVID-19. But there are an entire family of coronaviruses, one of which is the class of coronaviruses that cause the common cold. If you've ever had the cold, you've been infected by viruses. And there are antiviruses that are out there to prevent you from getting other viral infections like smallpox and polio and mumps and measles and chickenpox. All of those diseases are caused by viruses. But let's take the bulk of our time together right now to talk about the reproduction of viruses, because number one, it's kind of fascinating how this happens. But number two, if you want to prevent the spread of viruses, then, well, you've got to know how they reproduce. So I'm going to give you an example of, or an analogy of how I think viruses reproduce. So let me get something here. Hold on one moment. I'll be right there. I'm just getting something to illustrate how I view viruses. And I think it's a pretty good and accurate description of viruses. So here we go. Arg, matey, what you be doing there? Give me that plunder. I'm going to board your ship. Now, yes, I am dressing up as a pirate right now. Arg, matey! But what does a pirate have to do with viruses, you say? Well, let me show you what viruses have to do with pirating, or what pirating has to do with viruses. I think there is a complete connection between pirates and viruses. So let me explain it to you. How many of you have ever read about pirate ships? Maybe you've read about them in books. But if not, what do you think there are on pirate ships? Hopefully you said pirates, of course. Yes. And do any of you know what pirates do? And believe it or not, there are still pirates in the world today. They may not dress this way, but there are pirates in the world today, just as there have been pirates in the world of yesterday. But what do pirates do? Think about that for a moment. Well, I'm going to give you what they do in a brief little summary that I think will help illustrate what real viruses do. So I view viruses as pirates. And so the first thing that a pirate will do is attach their boat to a boat they're about to rob or take over. They have to attach themselves to the boat that will become their host in order to carry on their dirty deeds. And guess what? That's what viruses do to healthy cells. Viruses attach themselves to a host cell. But here's the deal. You may recall that picture of a bacteriophage that I showed you earlier of that particular virus, and different viruses have different shapes. And those different shapes give rise to a different way in which viruses can attach to certain cells, but not other cells. Think of it like a puzzle piece. Maybe some of you, when you were younger, either put puzzles together with different puzzle pieces, or maybe you had toys where you had to fit, a round peg into a round hole and a square peg into a square hole, and you couldn't fit a square peg into a round hole because it just didn't fit. It's kind of like viruses. Viruses are shaped in a particular way to fit on a particular cell in a particular way in order to attach themselves. But that's only the first step. So the first step in viral reproduction is that they attach themselves to a host cell. The next thing that happens with our pirate story is that you've got to board the ship. You've got to get one of your pirates initially, and then eventually more, but you've got to get a pirate on board the ship that you're taking over. And guess what? Viruses do the same thing. Viruses, once they plant themselves on a cell, they will literally inject, almost with a hypodermic needle that's smaller than microscopic, they inject their hereditary material into a healthy cell. Now think of our pirate story here for a moment. If you were on a cruise, just having a lovely time with friends and family, and all of a sudden you saw this pirate, this scary, powerful in your mind pirate boarding your ship, you might cower back and say, yikes, what do I do? They've got a big sword, they're ready to chop my head off, or whatever it might be, or a big gun, and you're unarmed. You might be scared. And that's kind of what happens on a cellular level. Because here's the deal. As that hereditary material is injected into a cell, it goes right for the captain. In fact, if a pirate wanted to take over another ship, do you know who they go after first? They go after the captain of the ship, because they know that if they take over the captain of the ship, all the passengers that are on board are pretty much powerless, because they may have no clue how to run the ship. Well, guess what? Viruses are just as smart, you might say, because the viruses, when they inject their hereditary material into a healthy cell, that hereditary material goes right to the nucleus. Because that hereditary material is well aware of the fact that if you can control the nucleus of a healthy cell, then you control the whole cell, just like a pirate can control the whole ship. And so once that nucleus is controlled by the hereditary material of that virus, unfortunately, that's where the story gets really ugly. Because in the case of viruses, that hereditary material reprograms the DNA in the nucleus. Kind of like a computer virus. Once it's in your computer, will reprogram your hard drive and will take over your computer, and your computer is worthless. A real virus will get into the control center, into the nucleus of the cell, take over the nucleus, reprogram the DNA so that the cell no longer undergoes mitosis, as we learned about in the first unit, in an appropriate way, but it will undergo mitosis, but it won't reproduce another healthy cell. No, that nucleus has been taken over, and when mitosis comes about, that alien viral hereditary material forces the nucleus of that cell to manufacture millions upon millions of new viruses instead of a healthy cell. And so, as a result, that hereditary material gets reproduced inside the cell. Remember, viruses are not living things. They can't reproduce by themselves. They have to infect a healthy cell, and that healthy cell ends up reproducing the nasty hereditary material. It's as if this pirate ship, once it takes over the captain, all of the other pirates can swing on board the ship and they are basically multiplied. In fact, they can coerce the passengers into complying with their requests, maybe even becoming pirates themselves in order to avoid being killed or walking the plank and plummeting into the depths of the sea. So whether we're talking about pirates or viruses, it's a very similar thing. And now here's the deal. In the case of our pirates, we not only now have one pirate ship, we've got two pirate ships. And those two pirate ships, both led by pirates, can now explode across the seven seas and take over other ships, turning them into pirate ships too. And guess what? With viruses, that's what happens, but on a much smaller scale and on a much larger scale, numerically speaking, because when that healthy cell explodes because of being overwhelmed with the millions of new viruses that have been formed, those new viruses get spread to all of the other healthy cells in the body, whether we're talking the body of a human or the body of an animal, regardless, all of those healthy cells that have been infected and injected and attacked by viruses, the reproduction of those viruses within that healthy cell, those surrounding cells have little chance but to become infected themselves. Some viruses spread faster than others, and this virus in this story spreads really, really quickly. It doesn't take long for a virus like this to explode from the cell, spread to others, and the whole cycle is repeated over and over again. Which is why it's so important when there is someone infected by a virus, not on purpose, but unwittingly, they become a virus manufacturing industry. Their bodies are viral factories. These viruses grow exponentially in all of the healthy cells. So while a healthy person who becomes infected with a virus is trying to fight the virus themselves, when you come into contact with any of the virus that this person is fighting themselves, they can spread it to you very easily. And before you know it, you are infected by that pirate ship as well. And you will be able to duplicate that virus and so on and so on. It happens exponentially. Look at the graphs on the news with this pandemic and how quickly the virus spreads through populations, and you'll see the J-shaped curve, and that J-shaped curve illustrates exponential growth. And so, in order to stop that exponential growth, you have to stop the viruses from spreading from one to another. So we've gone over these 5 steps of viral reproduction, and you're going to have to memorize it. But I want to give you a memory aid to help you remember the order in which viruses spread. So I'm going to show you a picture here, and I'm going to ask you a question. What critter do you see here? I think it's pretty obvious that they are ants. Now, what are those ants in? They are in cars. And if you look at these top 2 cars in particular, I think you can tell they are race cars. And these ants are racing everywhere. You might say ants in cars race everywhere. What did I say? Ants in cars race everywhere. Now, I think that's a silly picture that I have here. It's a silly little phrase, but are you catching on as to why I'm giving you this silly little phrase? I think it's easier for you to remember this silly little phrase than the 5 steps of viral reproduction. But if you have this silly little phrase, or one you can make up on your own, it might be easier for you to remember attach, inject, control, reproduce, explode. Ants in cars race everywhere is a memory aid to help you remember the 5 steps of viral reproduction. And if you can remember those 5 steps of viral reproduction, maybe you, and you're never too young to start, maybe you could come up with a brainstorming idea that could become a cure for viral spread in the world. Maybe you could come up with the new generation of vaccines that will stop the spread of viruses, like the virus that causes rabies, for instance. Maybe you will be the person to discover an antiviral medication that will stop this chain of viral reproduction in its tracks, and none of us will have to worry about being infected by a virus again. How cool would that be? And so I'm going to let you ponder that thought as I say for today, bye-bye.